told you to stop mowing the lawn. You are destroying the property value and you will stop right now.
There I was, standing in my front yard at 8 in the morning, trimmer in hand, when I heard the sirens. 2 police cars pulled up to my house, lights flashing red and blue across my quiet neighborhood. My neighbor Karen was standing on her lawn, pointing at me like I was some kind of criminal, shouting to the officers that I was breaking the law and disturbing the entire community. My heart pounded in my chest as the officers stepped out of their vehicles and started walking toward me. I couldn't believe this was happening. All I was doing was trimming my hedges, something I'd done every Saturday morning for the past 15 years. But Karen's face was red with anger, and she seemed absolutely convinced that I deserved to be arrested. What happened next would change everything in our neighborhood, and nobody, not even Karen herself, could have predicted how this simple Saturday morning would turn our entire community upside down. But before I tell you what happened when those officers reached my driveway, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your city and state in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another incredible story. Now, let me take you back to where this all started. My name is Harold Thompson, and I'm 72 years old. I've lived in the Sunny Meadows community for over 20 years now, ever since my late wife Margaret and I moved here. When I retired from teaching high school history, Margaret passed away 5 years ago, and since then, this house and this yard have been my whole world. Taking care of the lawn, the flowers, the hedges, it all reminds me of her. She loved gardening, and every time I'm out here with my hands in the dirt or trimming the bushes, I feel close to her again. Sunny Meadows is one of those planned communities with an HOA, a homeowners association. When Margaret and I first moved here, the HOA was pretty relaxed. Sure, they had rules about keeping your lawn mowed and not painting your house crazy colors, but nobody really bothered anyone. The monthly meetings were friendly, and our HOA president, a nice woman named Dorothy, always made sure everyone felt heard and respected. It was a real community back then, where neighbors knew each other's names and looked out for one another. But things started to change about 3 years ago when Dorothy moved to Florida to be closer to her grandchildren. That's when Karen Mitchell took over as HOA president. Now, I don't like to speak poorly of anyone, and I always try to see the best in people. But Karen made it very difficult. From the moment she became president, she treated the position like she was the queen of our little neighborhood, and we were all her subjects. Karen was in her mid-50s, always dressed like she was about to attend some fancy business meeting, even when she was just checking her mailbox. She had short blonde hair that looked like she spent hours getting it perfectly styled, and she wore these expensive-looking pantsuits in bright colors. But it wasn't her appearance that bothered people. It was her attitude. She seemed to think that every single rule in our HOA handbook was a matter of life and death, and she appointed herself as the enforcer. Within the first month of Karen becoming president, she started sending out violation notices to people for the smallest things. Mrs. Chen got a notice because her garden gnome was 2 inches taller than the allowed height for lawn decorations. The Johnsons got fined because their son's basketball hoop was visible from the street, even though it had been there for 5 years without any complaints. And, poor Mr. Rodriguez got threatened with legal action because he painted his front door a shade of blue that Karen said wasn't on the approved color list, even though 3 other houses on our street had similar blue doors. I managed to stay under Karen's radar for the most part. I kept my lawn neat, my house painted in approved colors, and I didn't have any decorations that could be considered violations, but I could see what was happening to our community. People who used to chat over fences and have block parties were now nervous and stressed. Everyone was afraid of getting another one of Karen's violation notices in their mailbox. The friendly, warm neighborhood that Margaret and I had fallen in love with was turning into a place where people were afraid to even plant flowers without checking the rule book first. About 6 months ago, things got personal between Karen and me. It started when I noticed that my neighbor on the other side, a young single mother named Jessica, was struggling. She worked 2 jobs to support her 8-year-old daughter Emma, and she just didn't have time to keep up with her yard the way the HOA demanded. Her grass was a bit long, and she had some weeds growing in her flower beds. I knew Jessica was doing her best, so one Saturday, I went over and offered to help her with her yard work. She was so grateful, she almost cried. I spent that morning mowing Jessica's lawn and pulling weeds from her garden. Emma came out and helped me plant some new flowers, and it reminded me of when I used to garden with my own grandchildren. It felt good to help someone who needed it, and it was exactly the kind of neighborly kindness that Margaret would have wanted me to show. But the next day, I found a letter in my mailbox from Karen. It was a formal notice informing me that I had violated HOA rules by doing yard work on someone else's property without prior written approval from the HOA board. I couldn't believe what I was reading. There was actually a rule that said you needed permission to help your neighbor with their yard. I read through the entire HOA handbook that night, and sure enough, Buried in Section 12, Subsection 4, there was a rule stating that all property maintenance must be performed by the property owner or a licensed professional, and that residents could not perform maintenance on other properties without board approval. It was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. I'd been a teacher for 40 years, and I'd dealt with plenty of bureaucracy and silly rules, but this was beyond anything I'd experienced. The purpose of that rule, I later learned, was supposed to prevent unlicensed contractors from doing work in the neighborhood. But Karen was using it to stop neighbors from helping each other. I decided to go to the next HOA meeting to address this. When I arrived at the community center, there were about 30 other residents there, which was actually a pretty good turnout. Karen sat at the front table with her gavel and her perfectly organized folders, looking very official and important. When it came time for resident concerns, I raised my hand and stood up. I explained calmly that I had received a violation notice for helping my neighbor with her yard, and I wanted to discuss whether this rule made sense for our community. I talked about how neighbors helping neighbors was what made a community strong, and how Margaret and I had moved here because it felt like a place where people cared about each other. Karen listened with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a tight line. When I finished, she didn't even pause before responding. She said that rules were rules, and that if we started making exceptions, the whole system would fall apart. She said that if everyone just did whatever they wanted, our property values would plummet, and Sunny Meadows would turn into a slum. I tried to reason with her. I pointed out that helping a neighbor maintain their property actually protected property values, not hurt them. But Karen wouldn't budge. She actually had the nerve to say that if Jessica couldn't maintain her property according to HOA standards, maybe she should consider moving somewhere more affordable. That comment made my blood boil. Here was this woman, sitting in judgment of a young mother working 2 jobs, suggesting she should leave her home just because she couldn't keep up with arbitrary yard work standards. I looked around the room and saw other people shaking their heads, clearly upset by Karen's cold response. But nobody said anything. They were all too afraid of becoming Karen's next target. I sat down, disappointed but not defeated. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to me privately and thanked me for speaking up. They shared their own stories of Karen's unreasonable enforcement of rules, but they all said the same thing. They were too worried about retaliation to challenge her publicly. That's when I realized that fear had taken over our community, and fear is a terrible thing to live with. It makes people small and suspicious instead of kind and generous. It was the opposite of everything Margaret and I believed in. Over the next few months, I watched Karen's reign of terror continue. She started doing weekly inspections of the neighborhood, walking around with a clipboard and taking notes on any potential violations. She hired a lawyer to send formal letters to people who didn't comply with her notices fast enough. She even tried to get the HOA to pass a new rule that would require all residents to submit their landscaping plans for approval before making any changes to their yards. But I also started to see something else. I saw neighbors beginning to push back in small ways. The Johnsons refused to take down their basketball hoop and challenged Karen to take them to court. Mrs. Chen added 2 more garden gnomes to her lawn in protest, and Jessica, with my help and the quiet support of several other neighbors, kept her yard looking beautiful, despite Karen's harassment. I continued my routine of Saturday morning yard work. Every weekend, I'd wake up early, have my coffee, and head outside around 7:30 or 8 o'clock to work on my lawn. I'd mow, trim hedges, pull weeds, and tend to the flower beds that Margaret had designed years ago. It was peaceful and meditative, and it helped me feel connected to my wife and to the home we'd built together. The HOA rule stated that no excessive noise was allowed before 9 a.m. on weekends, but there was no specific rule about yard work. Lawn mowers and trimmers made noise. Sure, but they weren't excessively loud, and I was always careful to use equipment that was well maintained and as quiet as possible. Plus, plenty of other neighbors did yard work in the morning too. It was actually the best time to do it before the Texas heat became unbearable. Karen had never said anything about my Saturday morning routine before. I figured she couldn't, since I wasn't actually violating any rules. But I should have known that wouldn't stop her forever. It was a beautiful Saturday morning in late spring when everything came to a head. The sun was just starting to warm up the day, and there was a nice breeze blowing. I had my coffee, put on my work gloves, and headed outside with my electric hedge trimmer. My hedges had grown quite a bit over the past few weeks, and they needed shaping before they got too wild. I started on the hedges along my front walkway, carefully trimming them into neat, rectangular shapes. I'd been working for maybe 20 minutes when I noticed Karen come out of her house across the street. She stood on her porch in her bathrobe, arms crossed, watching me with a scowl on her face. I gave her a friendly wave, trying to be neighborly despite our history. She didn't wave back. Instead, she pulled out her phone and appeared to be taking photos, or maybe video of me working. I felt a little uncomfortable being recorded, but I wasn't doing anything wrong. So I went back to my trimming. About 10 minutes later, Karen walked across the street toward me. She was still in her bathrobe, which was unusual for her. She always prided herself on being perfectly dressed and put together. "Harold," she called out in that sharp voice of hers. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" I turned off my trimmer and checked my watch. "It's about 8:15, Karen." "Good morning to you, too." 8:15 is too early for this kind of noise, she said, gesturing at my trimmer. "You're disturbing the entire neighborhood." I looked around. The neighborhood was quiet except for some birds chirping and a dog barking a few streets over. Nobody else seemed disturbed at all. "Karen, I've been doing yard work at this time for 15 years, I said calmly. "The HOA rules say no excessive noise before 9 a.m. But yard work isn't excessive noise. Plenty of people in the neighborhood do their lawn work in the morning. The rules say no excessive noise. And I, as HOA president, have determined that power tools before 9 a.m. constitute excessive noise," she said, her face getting red. "I'm ordering you to stop immediately. Now, I'm generally a peaceful man, and I believe in following reasonable rules. But this was not reasonable. Karen was making up interpretations of rules on the spot just to harass me, probably as payback for me challenging her at that meeting months ago. "I'm sorry, Karen, but I disagree with your interpretation," I said politely but firmly. "I'm going to continue with my yard work. If you want to propose a rule change about morning yard work hours, you're welcome to bring it up at the next HOA meeting." Karen's eyes went wide with fury. Nobody said no to her anymore. Everyone else in the neighborhood had learned to just comply with whatever she demanded, even when it was unreasonable. "If you don't stop right now, I'm calling the police," she threatened. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. "The police? For trimming my hedges? Karen, the police have real crimes to deal with. They're not going to come out here because someone is doing yard work at 8 in the morning. We'll see about that," she snapped, and she turned and marched back to her house. I shook my head and went back to my trimming. I honestly didn't think she'd actually call the police. It seemed too crazy, even for Karen. But I should have known better. I'd been working for maybe another 15 minutes when I heard the sirens. 2 police cars came speeding down our quiet street, their lights flashing and sirens wailing. My heart started pounding as I watched them pull up right in front of my house. I stood there frozen, my hedge trimmer still in my hand, trying to understand what was happening. Karen came rushing out of her house, now fully dressed in one of her bright pantsuits, pointing at me and shouting to the officers. "That's him. That's the man I called about," she yelled, her voice carrying across the whole neighborhood. "He's been breaking the law all morning, disturbing the peace with his loud machinery." I watched as 4 police officers stepped out of their vehicles. 2 of them were younger men, who looked like they were fresh out of the academy, and the other 2 were older, more experienced officers. One of the older officers, a tall African-American man with graying hair at his temples, held up his hand toward Karen. "Ma'am, please calm down," he said in a professional but firm voice. "Let us handle this." The officers started walking toward me, and I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me. My neighbors were starting to come out of their houses to see what all the commotion was about. Mrs. Chen stood on her porch with her hand over her mouth. The Johnsons came out with their teenage son, all of them looking shocked. Jessica appeared in her doorway with little Emma peeking out from behind her legs, both of them looking worried. I set down my hedge trimmer carefully on the ground and took off my work gloves. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the shock and humiliation of having police cars in front of my house like I was some kind of criminal. The tall officer who had spoken to Karen approached me first. His name tag read, Officer Martinez. He had kind eyes, and something about his calm demeanor made me feel a little less panicked. "Good morning, sir," he said. "I'm Officer Martinez. We received a call about a noise disturbance. Can you tell me what's going on here?" Before I could answer, Karen came rushing over, inserting herself into the conversation. "I'll tell you what's going on. This man has been using loud power tools since before 8 a.m., violating our HOA noise ordinances, and disturbing the entire neighborhood. I asked him nicely to stop, and he refused and became aggressive with me." "I did not become aggressive," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's simply not true." Officer Martinez held up his hand again. "Sir, I'd like to hear your side of things. What's your name?" "Harold Thompson. I live here. I've lived here for 20 years, I said. "I was just doing my regular Saturday morning yard work, trimming my hedges like I do every weekend. I started around 7:45 this morning." "He's lying. He's been out here making noise since 7:30, Karen interrupted. The other older officer, a white woman with red hair whose name tag said, Officer Brennan, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and let us conduct our investigation. We'll speak with you in a moment." Karen looked offended, but she took a few steps back, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. Officer Martinez turned back to me. "Mr. Thompson, can you show me what equipment you were using?" I pointed to my electric hedge trimmer lying on the ground. Just that trimmer, sir. It's electric, not gas-powered, so it's actually pretty quiet. Officer Brennan walked over and examined the trimmer. She picked it up and looked at it closely. This is a pretty standard electric trimmer, she said to Officer Martinez. These don't make excessive noise. Officer, there are laws about noise disturbances before 9 a.m., Karen called out from where she was standing. I know my rights. He's breaking the law. Officer Martinez pulled out a small notepad. Ma'am, in this city, the noise ordinance restricts construction work and excessively loud activities before 7 a.m. on weekdays and 8 a.m. on weekends. Standard yard maintenance with residential equipment doesn't typically qualify as excessive noise. What time did you say you started, Mr. Thompson? Around 7:45, maybe 7:50, I said. I always wait until at least 7:45 on weekends to be respectful of my neighbors. That's still too early, Karen shouted. Our HOA rules clearly state no excessive noise before 9 a.m. Officer Brennan turned to Karen. Ma'am, HOA rules don't supersede city ordinances. If Mr. Thompson is complying with city noise ordinances, he's not breaking any laws. I saw Karen's face turn even redder. This clearly wasn't going the way she'd expected. But he's disturbing the peace. I couldn't sleep with all that noise, she sputtered. Officer Martinez looked around at the gathering neighbors. Did anyone else hear excessive noise this morning? Anyone else disturbed by Mr. Thompson's yard work? There was silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Chen spoke up from her porch. I heard nothing unusual, officers. Harold does his yard work every Saturday morning. It's never been a problem. Same here, Mr. Johnson called out. I was already awake, didn't notice anything loud at all. Jessica stepped forward, still holding Emma's hand. I was up making breakfast, and I didn't hear anything disturbing. Mr. Thompson is always very considerate about noise. One by one, my neighbors spoke up, and not a single one of them said I'd been too loud or disturbed them. I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. These were the same people who'd been too afraid to stand up to Karen at HOA meetings, but here they were, telling the truth to the police. Karen looked around wildly, clearly shocked that nobody was supporting her complaint. They're all lying. They're all in on this together. This is a conspiracy against me. Officer Martinez wrote something in his notepad and then looked at Karen seriously. Ma'am, making false reports to the police is a serious matter. We've determined that no laws were broken here. Mr. Thompson has every right to do yard work on his own property as long as he's complying with city ordinances, which he is. This is outrageous, Karen practically screamed. I'm the HOA president. I have authority in this neighborhood. Your HOA authority doesn't extend to city laws, ma'am, Officer Brennan said firmly. And calling 911 for non-emergencies wastes police resources that could be used for actual emergencies. I watched as Karen seemed to realize that she'd made a terrible mistake. Her face went from red to pale, and she started backtracking. Well, I just thought. As HOA president, I have a responsibility to enforce the rules. Officer Martinez closed his notepad. Mr. Thompson, you're free to continue with your yard work. You haven't violated any laws. He turned to Karen. Ma'am, we're going to let you off with a warning this time. But please don't call 911 unless there's an actual emergency. If you have disputes about HOA rules, those need to be handled through your HOA procedures, not by calling the police. The officers started walking back to their vehicles, and I felt my whole body relax. I'd never had any interaction with the police before, other than a speeding ticket 20 years ago, and having them show up at my house had been terrifying. But before the officers could get in their cars, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Chen came down from her porch and walked right up to the officers. Excuse me, officers, she said in her gentle voice with just a hint of her Chinese accent. I think you should know something. This is not the first time Mrs. Mitchell has harassed people in this neighborhood. She has made many of our lives very difficult with her unreasonable enforcement of HOA rules. Officer Brennan stopped and turned around, looking interested. What do you mean, ma'am? And then, it was like a dam broke. The neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up at HOA meetings suddenly found their voices. Mr. Johnson came forward and told the officers about how Karen had threatened him with legal action over his son's basketball hoop. Jessica explained how Karen had tried to fine her repeatedly for minor yard issues and had even suggested she should move out of the neighborhood. Another neighbor, an older gentleman named Frank who lived 2 houses down, talked about how Karen had reported him to the city for having an unauthorized vegetable garden in his backyard, even though there was no rule against it. The officers listened to all of this, and I could see their expressions changing from simply wanting to resolve a noise complaint to realizing there was a bigger pattern of behavior here. Karen tried to defend herself. I'm just doing my job as HOA president. I'm trying to maintain property values and community standards. By harassing your neighbors and calling the police on someone doing yard work? Officer Martinez said. And there was definitely a note of disapproval in his voice now. One of the younger officers had been walking around, and he suddenly called out, "Hey, Martinez, come look at this." We all turned to see what he was pointing at. The young officer was standing by Karen's car, which was parked in her driveway. He was looking at something on the ground. Officer Martinez walked over, and I saw his eyebrows go up. "Ma'am, is this your vehicle?" he asked Karen. "Yes, why?" Karen said defensively. "Your registration sticker is expired," he said. "Has been for 3 months according to this." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. I've been meaning to renew it. I've just been so busy with HOA duties. Driving with expired registration is actually against the law, Officer Brennan said. Unlike doing yard work at 8 a.m., the irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. Here was Karen, who had just called the police on me for supposedly breaking the law. And she was the one who was actually breaking a law. Officer Martinez walked back to Karen. "I'm going to have to write you a citation for the expired registration. And ma'am, I strongly suggest you think carefully before making frivolous calls to 911 inches the future. Next time, there may be consequences beyond just a warning." Karen looked absolutely mortified as Officer Martinez wrote out the ticket. Her face was so red I thought she might actually explode. All of our neighbors were watching, and I could see some of them trying to hide smiles. After the officers finished with the ticket and gave Karen a final warning about misusing emergency services, they got back in their cars and drove away, turning off their sirens and lights. The sudden quiet that followed was almost deafening. Karen stood in her driveway, clutching the ticket in her hand, looking around at all the neighbors who were still outside. I could see tears of anger and humiliation in her eyes. For a moment, I actually felt sorry for her, despite everything she'd put everyone through. But then she turned and looked directly at me, and the look in her eyes was pure hatred. "This isn't over, Harold," she said in a low, threatening voice. "You're going to regret embarrassing me like this." She stormed back into her house and slammed the door so hard I was surprised the windows didn't break. The neighbors slowly started to disperse, many of them stopping by to shake my hand or pat me on the shoulder. Mrs. Chen gave me a hug and whispered, "Thank you for standing up to her. You're very brave." Jessica came over with Emma. "Mr. Thompson, I was so scared when I saw those police cars," she said. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, dear," I assured her. "Just a bit shaken up, but fine." Little Emma looked up at me with her big brown eyes. "Why was Mrs. Mitchell so mean to you, Mr. Thompson? You didn't do anything wrong." I knelt down so I was at her level. "Sometimes, Emma, people get so focused on rules and being in charge that they forget about being kind. It's a sad thing, but it happens. My mom says you're the nicest person in the neighborhood," Emma said. "I think she's silly for being mean to nice people." That made me smile despite everything. "Thank you, sweetheart. You're pretty nice yourself." After everyone went back to their houses, I stood in my yard for a few minutes, just trying to process what had just happened. In all my 72 years, I'd never imagined I'd have police cars in front of my house, lights flashing. Because I was trimming my hedges, I picked up my hedge trimmer and looked at it. Part of me wanted to just put it away and go inside, to avoid any more confrontation. But another part of me, the part that had been a teacher for 40 years and had never backed down from doing what was right, told me that giving in to Karen's bullying would be wrong. So I started the trimmer back up and continued working on my hedges. My hands were steadier now, and there was something satisfying about finishing what I'd started. If Karen wanted to watch from her window and stew in her anger, that was her choice. I worked for another hour, finishing the hedges and then moving on to weeding the flower beds. As I worked, I thought about Margaret and how she would have handled this situation. She'd always been better at dealing with difficult people than I was. She had this way of staying calm and kind even when others were being unreasonable. "Kill them with kindness, Harold," she used to say. It's hard to stay angry at someone who treats you with genuine kindness, but I also knew that Margaret wouldn't have wanted me to be a doormat. She'd always encouraged me to stand up for what was right, to speak the truth even when it was uncomfortable. That's what I'd tried to do, and that's what I'd keep doing. Around 10:30, I finished up my yard work and put my tools away in the garage. I was hot and sweaty and ready for a shower. As I walked back to my house, I noticed a car I didn't recognize pulling up across the street. It parked in front of Karen's house, and a man in an expensive-looking suit got out, carrying a briefcase. He knocked on Karen's door, and she answered almost immediately. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw her gesture animatedly, pointing at my house several times. The man nodded, wrote some things down in a notepad, and then got back in his car and drove away. Something about that interaction made me uneasy. Karen had said this wasn't over, and I had a feeling she was already planning her next move. Whatever it was, I doubted it would be pleasant. I went inside, took a long shower, and made myself some lunch. I tried to relax and watch some television, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened that morning and what might happen next. I'd stood up to Karen, and my neighbors had supported me, but Karen wasn't the type of person to accept defeat gracefully. That evening, around 6 o'clock, I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, I found Mr. Johnson and his wife standing there, along with Mrs. Chen, Frank, and Jessica. They all looked serious. "Harold, can we come in?" Mr. Johnson asked. "We need to talk to you about something." I invited them all into my living room, offering drinks and wondering what this was about. They settled onto my couches and chairs, and there was an awkward silence for a moment before Mr. Johnson spoke. "We've all been talking," he said, "and we think you should know what you might be up against. After what happened this morning, we're worried that Karen is going to retaliate against you. We've all been on the receiving end of her vindictiveness," Frank added. "When she feels threatened or embarrassed, she doesn't just let things go. She escalates." Mrs. Chen leaned forward. "That man in the suit who visited her this afternoon?" I recognized him. "His name is Richard Stevens. He's a lawyer who specializes in HOA litigation. Karen has used him before to threaten people." My stomach sank. "She's going to sue me?" "Possibly," Jessica said quietly. "She tried to threaten me with legal action last year, claiming I was in violation of multiple HOA rules, and that she could put a lien on my house. It scared me so much I almost moved. The only reason I didn't was because I couldn't afford to." "That's horrible," I said, feeling angry on her behalf. "We want to help you, Harold," Mr. Johnson said. "This morning, when we all spoke up in front of the police, it felt good. It felt like we were finally standing together instead of living in fear. A bunch of us have been emailing back and forth all day, and we want to do something about Karen's abuse of power." "What did you have in mind?" I asked. Frank pulled out some papers from a folder he'd brought. "I did some research on HOA governance. Did you know that as residents, we have the right to call for a special meeting and even vote to remove a board member if we have cause?" I hadn't known that. In all my years living here, I'd never really dug into the details of how our HOA operated. "The problem is," Mrs. Chen said, "we need a majority of the residents to support it. And while a lot of people are unhappy with Karen, many of them are still too afraid to go against her openly. But after this morning," Jessica added, "some people might be ready to finally stand up. We were thinking we could start organizing, talking to neighbors, seeing if we can get enough support to challenge her position." I listened to all of this with mixed feelings. Part of me was proud of my neighbors for wanting to take action, but another part of me worried about what this might do to our community. Fighting with Karen could tear the neighborhood apart even more than her leadership already had. "I appreciate what you're all trying to do," I said slowly, "but I don't want to be the cause of even more division in Sunny Meadows. Maybe we should try to find a peaceful solution first." "Harold, there is no peaceful solution with Karen," Frank said bluntly. "We've all tried reasoning with her, being nice to her, following her rules. It doesn't matter. She sees kindness as weakness, and she uses it against people." I thought about that. It was true that Karen had shown no willingness to compromise or listen to anyone's concerns, but I still believed that there had to be a better way than fighting fire with fire. "Let me think about it," I said. "Give me a few days to consider the best approach. In the meantime, don't do anything that might provoke her further." They agreed, though I could see some of them were disappointed that I wasn't ready to jump into battle immediately. After they left, I sat in my quiet living room and thought about everything that had happened. Margaret's picture sat on the mantel, smiling at me from a photo taken on our 30th wedding anniversary. "What would you do, my love?" I asked the picture, softly. I didn't have an answer, but I knew that whatever happened next, I needed to stay true to the values Margaret and I had always shared: kindness, integrity, standing up for what's right, but also trying to see the humanity in everyone, even people like Karen, who made it very difficult. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about Karen's threatening words and the lawyer who had visited her. What was she planning? Would she really try to sue me or take some other action against me? The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing what was coming. The next morning was Sunday, and I usually attended services at the community church just outside our neighborhood. I'd been going there since Margaret and I first moved to Sunny Meadows, and it had become an important part of my weekly routine. The pastor, Reverend Williams, was a good man who gave thoughtful sermons and knew most of his congregation by name. I got dressed and drove to church, grateful for the distraction from yesterday's drama. But when I walked into the sanctuary, I saw that the drama had followed me there. Karen was sitting in one of the front pews, which was unusual because she only came to church occasionally, usually on Easter and Christmas. She turned around as people were filing in, and when she saw me, she made a big show of whispering to the woman sitting next to her, while looking in my direction. I could see other members of the congregation glancing at me curiously. Karen was spreading her version of yesterday's events, painting herself as the victim, and me as some kind of troublemaker. I held my head high and took my usual seat near the back. I wasn't going to let Karen's gossip chase me away from my church. Reverend Williams's sermon that morning was about forgiveness and loving your enemies. I couldn't help but feel like God was speaking directly to me through his words. The Reverend talked about how holding on to anger and resentment only hurts ourselves, and how true strength comes from responding to hatred with love. After the service, as people were gathering in the fellowship hall for coffee and donuts, several people approached me. Some were curious about what had really happened yesterday, having heard Karen's version. I explained calmly and honestly what had occurred, without embellishing or speaking badly about Karen. I just told the truth, but there were also a few people who seemed to have already made up their minds based on what Karen had told them. One woman, a friend of Karen's named Diane, actually said to me, "I always thought you were such a nice man, Harold. I'm disappointed that you would cause such trouble in the neighborhood." Before I could respond, Reverend Williams appeared at my side. "Diane, I think there might be more to this story than you've heard. Perhaps we shouldn't rush to judgment." He turned to me with kind eyes. "Harold, would you like to take a walk with me?" We stepped outside into the sunny morning, walking through the church's small garden. Reverend Williams didn't say anything for a moment. Just let me gather my thoughts. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, Reverend," I finally said. "I was just doing my yard work, something I've done every Saturday for 20 years. But somehow it's turned into this big conflict, and I don't know how to resolve it." "Tell me everything," he said gently. So I did. I told him about Karen's increasingly unreasonable behavior as HOA president, about how she'd harassed Jessica and other neighbors, about the police being called, and about how my neighbors now wanted to organize against her. Reverend Williams listened carefully, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, thinking. "You know, Harold," he finally said, "one of the hardest things in life is knowing when to stand firm and when to show grace. It sounds to me like you're trying to do both, which is admirable but not always easy." "I just don't want to make things worse," I said. "Margaret always said that kindness was the answer to almost everything. But I also can't just let Karen bully people." "Your Margaret was a wise woman," Reverend Williams said with a smile. "I remember her well. But I also remember that she wasn't afraid to speak truth to power when necessary. Kindness doesn't mean being a doormat. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is set boundaries and stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves." His words resonated with me. Margaret had been kind, but she'd also been strong. She'd taught me that you could be both. "What would you suggest I do?" I asked. "Pray on it," he said. "And maybe try one more time to reach out to Karen directly, person to person, before this escalates further. Sometimes people who are hurting or afraid express it through anger and control. Maybe if you can understand what's really driving her behavior, you can find a path forward." I wasn't sure that would work with someone like Karen, but I appreciated the Reverend's optimism and faith in human nature. When I got home from church, I spent the afternoon thinking about his suggestion. Could I really try to have a genuine conversation with Karen after everything that had happened? Would she even be willing to talk to me? I was still pondering this when, around 4 in the afternoon, I heard a commotion outside. I looked out my window and saw a large truck parked in front of Karen's house. Men were unloading what looked like surveying equipment. I stepped outside to see what was going on, and so did several other neighbors. Karen emerged from her house, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, which was extremely unusual for her. She was directing the men, pointing toward various properties on our street. Mr. Johnson came over to stand next to me. "What's she up to now?" he muttered. We didn't have to wait long to find out. One of the men with surveying equipment started setting up right at the edge of my property line, measuring something. Then Karen walked over to me with a smug smile on her face. "Harold," she said sweetly, though her eyes were cold, "I've hired a professional surveying company to verify all the property lines on our street. I have reason to believe that your hedges may be encroaching on HOA common property. If they are, you'll need to remove them immediately, at your own expense, of course." I stared at her in disbelief. My hedges had been in the same place for 20 years. They weren't encroaching on anything. "Karen, those hedges were planted by the original developers," I said. "They're well within my property line. We'll let the professionals determine that," she said with false sweetness. "I'm just doing my due diligence as HOA president to ensure all properties are in compliance." The surveyor worked for about an hour, taking measurements and making notes. Karen stood there the whole time, arms crossed, looking triumphant. All of our neighbors had come out to watch, and the tension in the air was thick. Finally, the surveyor came over and showed Karen his findings on a tablet. I watched her face fall as she looked at whatever he was showing her. She argued with him for a moment, pointing at my hedges, but he shook his head firmly. Then the surveyor walked over to me. Mr. Thompson, I wanted to let you know that your hedges are completely within your property boundaries. In fact, they're a good 6 inches inside your property line. No violations whatsoever. Thank you, I said, feeling relieved but not surprised. Karen's face was red again. She'd spent what must have been hundreds of dollars on a surveyor, hoping to find something to use against me, and it had backfired completely. But as the surveying truck drove away and Karen stalked back to her house, I had a terrible feeling that this was only the beginning. Karen wasn't going to give up. She was going to keep coming after me, finding new ways to harass and intimidate me, until either she succeeded in driving me out of the neighborhood, or something else happened to stop her. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a decision. I would take Reverend Williams's advice, and try one more time to reach out to Karen as a human being. I would try to understand what was really driving her behavior and see if there was any way to resolve this peacefully. But I also knew that if that didn't work, I would have to stand firm. I couldn't let her continue to bully me and my neighbors. Sometimes standing up for what's right means fighting, even when you'd rather not. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard my phone buzz with a text message. It was from Mrs. Chen. Harold, check your email. Karen sent something to the whole neighborhood. You need to see this. I got up and opened my email on my computer. There, at the top of my inbox, was a message from Karen to the entire Sunny Meadows HOA mailing list. The subject line read, Emergency HOA meeting, called, Vote to impose special assessment. With a sinking feeling, I clicked on the email and began to read. Karen had called an emergency meeting for Tuesday evening, just 2 days away. The purpose of the meeting was to vote on a special assessment that would require every homeowner to pay an additional $2,000 for enhanced neighborhood security measures and legal consultation fees to protect our community standards. At the bottom of the email, in smaller text, was a note that made my blood run cold. These enhanced measures have become necessary due to recent incidents of residents challenging HOA authority and encouraging disrespect for community rules. All residents are expected to attend and vote on this important matter. She was going after everyone, trying to punish the entire neighborhood financially, because people had supported me, and $2,000 was a significant amount of money for many of my neighbors, especially people like Jessica, who were already struggling. My phone started ringing. It was Mr. Johnson. Harold, did you see the email? I just read it, I said, my voice tight with anger. This is outrageous. She can't just impose a special assessment as punishment. There are rules about this kind of thing. Can she really do this? I asked. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Frank and I are going to dig into the HOA bylaws tonight. There has to be something we can do to stop her. After I hung up with Mr. Johnson, my phone rang again, and again, and again. Neighbors calling, texting, emailing, all of them panicked and angry about Karen's special assessment. I tried to calm people down, but inside, I was furious. Karen had crossed a line. She wasn't just coming after me anymore. She was going after everyone, using money as a weapon to force people back into submission. As I finally turned off my phone and tried to get some sleep, I realized that Reverend Williams's suggestion of reaching out to Karen was probably no longer viable. This had escalated beyond a simple conflict between neighbors. This was now a battle for the soul of our community, and despite my desire for peace and my belief in kindness, I knew that sometimes you have to fight for what's right. The meeting on Tuesday was going to be explosive. I just hoped that when the dust settled, our neighborhood would still be standing. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that email from Karen, threatening the entire neighborhood with a $2,000 assessment. I kept thinking about Jessica and how she was already working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. I thought about Mrs. Chen, who was on a fixed retirement income. I thought about all my neighbors who had finally found the courage to stand up to Karen, only to now face financial punishment for it. By 6 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and got out of bed. I made myself a strong pot of coffee and sat at my kitchen table, looking at Margaret's picture on the wall. I need your wisdom now more than ever, I said to her smiling face. How do I fight someone who's willing to hurt innocent people just to get back at me? As the sun came up, my phone started buzzing with messages again. A group chat had formed overnight with about 20 of my neighbors. They were sharing information, making plans, and most importantly, they were angry. The fear that had kept them silent for so long had transformed into determination. Mr. Johnson had stayed up late researching HOA law, and he'd found some important information. According to our HOA bylaws, any special assessment over $1,000 required a vote of approval from at least 75% of all homeowners, not just those who attended the meeting, and the vote had to be announced at least 30 days in advance, not 2 days. She's violating our own bylaws, Mr. Johnson wrote in the group chat. This meeting she's called isn't even legal. Frank added more information. He'd found the contact information for the management company that handled the official HOA paperwork and finances. I'm going to call them first thing Monday morning, he wrote. They need to know what Karen is trying to do. I felt a glimmer of hope. My neighbors weren't going to roll over and accept this. They were educating themselves, organizing, and preparing to fight back legally and properly. Monday morning came, and I was up early again. I spent some time in my garden, pulling weeds and watering the flowers. The physical work helped calm my nerves. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Frank. "Harold, I just got off the phone with the management company," he said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. They had no idea Karen called this emergency meeting. When I told them about the special assessment, they were shocked. Apparently, she never consulted with them or followed any of the proper procedures. "What did they say they would do?" I asked. "They're sending a representative to the meeting tomorrow night, and they're going to bring copies of the actual bylaws and procedures that Karen is supposed to follow." "Harold, I think we might actually be able to stop this." After I hung up with Frank, I sat down and did something I'd been thinking about since Reverend Williams's suggestion. I wrote a letter to Karen, not an angry letter or an accusatory one, but a genuine attempt to reach out as one human being to another. I wrote about how I remembered when she first moved to the neighborhood 5 years ago, before she became HOA president. She'd seemed friendly then, even kind. I wrote about how I understood that being in charge of an HOA was probably stressful and thankless work. I acknowledged that she probably genuinely believed she was doing what was best for the neighborhood, but I also wrote honestly about how her approach had hurt people. I talked about Jessica struggling as a single mother, and how Karen's harassment had made her life harder instead of better. I mentioned Mrs. Chen and the absurdity of being cited for Garden Gnome Heights. I explained how the special assessment would genuinely harm families who were already struggling financially. I ended the letter with an invitation. "Karen, before tomorrow night's meeting, would you be willing to sit down with me and just talk? Not as HOA president and resident, but as two neighbors who both want what's best for Sunny Meadows. I believe we can find a better path forward than this conflict." I printed the letter, put it in an envelope, and walked across the street to Karen's house. My heart was pounding as I rang her doorbell. Part of me hoped she wouldn't answer, but part of me hoped she would. The door opened, and Karen stood there in her usual perfect outfit, her hair styled, her makeup flawless. But up close, I could see that she looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes that her makeup couldn't quite hide. "What do you want?" "Harold," she said coldly. I held out the envelope. "I wrote you a letter. I'm asking you, please, to read it before tomorrow's meeting, and I'm asking if you'd be willing to talk with me, really talk, about finding a better way forward." She took the envelope but didn't open it. "There's nothing to talk about. The meeting will proceed as planned tomorrow night. Karen, that special assessment is going to hurt people. Good people who are already struggling. Is that really what you want?" For just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Doubt? Regret? But then her expression hardened again. "Those people should have thought about that before they turned against me." "They didn't turn against you," I said gently. "They just told the truth to the police about what they heard that morning. You can't punish people for telling the truth." "I'm not punishing anyone," she snapped. "I'm implementing necessary security measures for our community. If people can't afford to live here, maybe they should consider living somewhere else." Those words, so cold and dismissive of people's real struggles, made my patience finally snap. "Is that what this is really about, Karen? Forcing out anyone who can't afford your arbitrary fees? Turning our neighborhood into some kind of exclusive club where only people you approve of can live?" "How dare you?" she said, her voice rising. "I have worked tirelessly for this community. I've sacrificed my time, my energy, everything to make Sunny Meadows a place of excellence and high standards. And what thanks do I get? People like you undermining my authority and turning everyone against me." "Nobody turned anyone against you," I said, my own voice getting louder now. "You did this to yourself with your unreasonable rules and your complete lack of compassion for your neighbors." We stood there on her porch, both of us angry, both of us frustrated, and I realized that Reverend Williams had been wrong. Some people were too entrenched in their position, too convinced of their own righteousness, to reach through genuine conversation. Karen's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of rage, not sadness. "Get off my property," she said in a low, shaking voice. "And I suggest you get a lawyer, Harold, because after tomorrow night, you're going to need one." She slammed the door in my face, and I heard the lock click. I stood there for a moment, the letter I'd written still in her hand, behind that closed door, knowing it would probably never be read. I walked back to my house feeling defeated. I'd tried to find a peaceful solution, tried to reach out with kindness and understanding, but some people simply wouldn't accept anything less than total control and submission. That afternoon, the neighborhood group chat was buzzing with activity. Word had spread about the management company sending a representative, and people were making plans to attend the meeting in force. Someone had even printed out copies of the HOA bylaws to distribute to everyone. Jessica messaged me privately. "Mr. Thompson, I'm scared. I can't afford $2,000. If they really make us pay that, I'll have to choose between that and Emma's school supplies and clothes. What am I going to do?" My heart broke reading her message. "Don't worry, Jessica," I typed back. "We're not going to let that happen. Trust me. Be at the meeting tomorrow night, and we'll handle this together." But privately, I wasn't entirely sure we could stop Karen. Yes, she was violating bylaws, but she had a lawyer on her side. She had the official authority of HOA president. What if the management company representative couldn't actually do anything? What if this all came down to a vote and Karen had somehow secured enough support among residents who didn't live on our street and didn't know what was really happening? That night, I couldn't eat dinner. My stomach was in knots thinking about the meeting the next day. I tried to watch television, but I couldn't focus. Finally, around 8 o'clock, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, I was surprised to see Reverend Williams standing there with a covered dish in his hands. "I heard through the church grapevine that you might be having a difficult time," he said with a kind smile. "I brought you some of my wife's famous chicken casserole. May I come in?" I invited him in, grateful for the company and the food that I probably needed even though I didn't feel like eating. We sat in my living room, and I told him everything that had happened since Sunday, including my failed attempt to reach out to Karen. "I tried what you suggested," I said. "But she wouldn't listen. She just got angrier." Reverend Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes, Harold, we can extend grace and kindness to someone, and they're not ready to receive it. That doesn't mean we were wrong to try. It just means they have their own journey to walk, their own lessons to learn." "But what about all the people she's going to hurt with this assessment?" I asked. "How do I stop that?" "You stand up for them," he said simply. "You've already been doing that. You spoke truth at the HOA meeting months ago. You refused to be bullied when she called the police. You tried to reach out with compassion. And now, tomorrow night, you'll stand with your neighbors and fight for what's right. That's all any of us can do." "I'm just an old man," I said, feeling the weight of my 72 years. "I taught history for 40 years. I was good at that. But this kind of conflict, this kind of confrontation, it's not who I am." "Actually, Harold, I think it's exactly who you are," Reverend Williams said. "You taught young people about standing up against injustice, about civil rights movements and people who fought for what was right even when it was hard. Now you're living those lessons. Your Margaret would be very proud of you." His words brought tears to my eyes. I missed Margaret so much in that moment. She'd always been my courage when I felt weak, my wisdom when I felt confused. After Reverend Williams left, I finally ate some of the casserole his wife had made. Then I went to bed early, hoping to get enough sleep to face whatever tomorrow would bring. Tuesday arrived cloudy and gray, matching my mood. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the community center. I spent the day trying to stay busy. But my mind kept drifting to what might happen that evening. Around 5 o'clock, Mr. Johnson called. "Harold, the management company representative just called me. Her name is Linda Hernandez, and she'll be at the meeting. She asked me to gather any documentation we have about Karen's violations of bylaws. I've been putting together a whole file." "What kind of violations?" I asked. "Well, for starters, this special assessment that wasn't properly announced, but also, I found evidence that she's been using HOA funds to pay for personal legal consultations. And she approved several contracts with vendors without getting the required competitive bids. Harold, I think she's been mismanaging the HOA finances for months. This was bigger than I'd thought. If Karen had actually been misusing HOA funds, that was serious." At 6:30, I got dressed and walked to the community center. It was only a few blocks away, and I wanted the time to clear my head. As I walked, I saw many of my neighbors also heading in the same direction. People waved to me, some stopping to walk with me. By the time we reached the community center, there was already a crowd gathered outside. I'd never seen this many people at an HOA meeting before. Usually, only 10 or 15 residents showed up. Tonight, it looked like at least 60 or 70 people were there. Inside, the main meeting room was set up with rows of chairs facing a table at the front where Karen and the other board members usually sat. But tonight, there were only 2 people at that table, Karen, and a man I recognized as Richard Stevens, her lawyer. Karen looked surprised and unsettled by the large turnout. She kept whispering to her lawyer and shuffling papers nervously. At exactly 7 o'clock, Karen stood up and banged her gavel on the table. "This emergency meeting of the Sunny Meadows Homeowners Association is now called to order." But before she could say anything else, the back door of the room opened, and a professional-looking woman in a business suit walked in, carrying a briefcase. She was Hispanic, probably in her 40s, with an air of calm authority. "Excuse me," she said in a clear, strong voice. "I'm Linda Hernandez, from Summit HOA Management Services. I'm the official management representative for this HOA, and I need to speak before this meeting proceeds." Karen's face went pale. "This is a closed HOA meeting for residents only. Actually, Miss Mitchell, as the management company representative, I have the right and the responsibility to attend any official HOA meeting, and I have some serious concerns about the legality of this meeting and the proposed special assessment." The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Linda walked to the front of the room and set her briefcase on the table. "According to the Sunny Meadows HOA bylaws, which I have right here, any special assessment exceeding $1,000 requires a 30-day notice period and approval by 75% of all homeowners, not just those present at a meeting. This meeting was called with only 2 days' notice, violating those bylaws." "I called an emergency meeting," Karen said, but her voice was shaking. "The bylaws allow for emergency meetings." "Yes, for emergencies," Linda said. "Things like natural disasters, immediate safety hazards, or urgent building repairs. Personal disputes with residents do not constitute an emergency." Karen's lawyer leaned over and whispered something to her. She shook her head stubbornly and stood up. "I am the president of this HOA, and I have the authority to determine what constitutes an emergency." "Actually, you don't," Linda said calmly. "And there's more. I've been reviewing the HOA financial records, and I've found several irregularities. You've approved payments to your personal lawyer, Mr. Stevens here, without board approval. You've hired contractors without getting competitive bids as required, and you've used HOA funds for what appear to be personal purposes." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Karen's face went from pale to bright red. "That's a lie," she shouted. "I've done everything by the book." "Then you won't mind an independent audit of the HOA finances," Linda said. "Which I'm formally requesting on behalf of the management company." Mr. Johnson stood up from his seat. "I second that request, and I have documentation of several other bylaw violations by President Mitchell that I'd like to enter into the record." Frank stood up next. "I'd also like to call for a vote of no confidence in Karen Mitchell as HOA president." More and more residents stood up, voicing their support for an audit and for removing Karen from her position. The meeting had completely spiraled out of Karen's control. Karen's lawyer stood up and tried to restore order, but Linda held up her hand. "Mr. Stevens, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. As of this moment, Summit HOA management is taking over the administration of this HOA until a proper investigation can be conducted and new elections can be held." "You can't do that," Karen screamed. "I'm the president." "You were the president," Linda said firmly. "But when an HOA president is found to have violated bylaws and possibly misappropriated funds, the management company has the authority to step in. That authority is clearly spelled out in your management contract, which I also have right here." I watched as Karen seemed to crumble before our eyes. All her power, all her authority, all her control was being stripped away in a matter of minutes. Her lawyer was gathering his papers, clearly wanting to distance himself from the situation. The other board members who were supposed to be at the table but hadn't shown up had apparently known this was coming and abandoned her. Karen looked around the room at all the faces of the neighbors she'd bullied and harassed. She saw no sympathy, no support, only anger and resentment that had been building for years. "You're all going to regret this," she said, her voice breaking. "I was trying to protect this neighborhood, to keep our standards high, to maintain our property values. You'll see what happens when you let just anyone do whatever they want." Jessica stood up, holding Emma's hand. "Karen, you weren't protecting the neighborhood. You were terrorizing it. You made people afraid to live in their own homes. You tried to force me out just because I'm a single mother who works hard but doesn't meet your standards of perfection. That's not protection. That's bullying." Misu's Chen stood up next. "You treated us like subjects instead of neighbors. You forgot that an HOA is supposed to serve the community, not rule over it." One by one, people stood up and shared how Karen's leadership had affected them. Some were angry, some were sad. But all of them were finally finding their voices after being silenced by fear for so long. Karen listened to it all, tears streaming down her face now, her makeup running. And then, she did something I didn't expect. She sat down, put her face in her hands, and began to sob. The room fell silent again. Despite everything she'd done, seeing another human being in such pain was difficult to witness. I found myself standing up and walking to the front of the room. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the teacher in me, always wanting to find the lesson in every situation. Maybe it was Margaret's voice in my head, reminding me about kindness even in the hardest moments. I stood near Karen, not too close, but close enough that she could hear me. "Karen," I said softly, "I think somewhere along the way, You forgot that being a leader means serving people, not controlling them. You forgot that rules are supposed to help communities thrive, not to punish people who don't meet impossible standards. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. I just wanted everything to be perfect, she whispered. I wanted our neighborhood to be the best. I wanted to matter, to be important, and there it was. The truth beneath all the anger and control. Karen wasn't a villain. She was a hurt, insecure person who had tried to find worth and importance through power and control. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it helped me understand it. You could have mattered by being kind, I said. You could have been important by helping people instead of judging them. It's not too late to learn that lesson. Karen just shook her head and stood up. I need to go, she said. She grabbed her purse and walked out of the community center, her lawyer following behind her. After she left, Linda Hernandez took charge of the meeting. She explained that the management company would be administering the HOA directly for the next 60 days, while they conducted a full audit and organized proper elections for a new board. She canceled the special assessment immediately and promised that any funds that had been misused would be recovered and returned to the HOA. She also announced that she would be reviewing all of Karen's violation notices and fines from the past year. Many of these appear to be overly harsh or based on incorrect interpretations of the rules, she said. We'll be issuing refunds where appropriate. The relief in the room was palpable. People were smiling, hugging each other. And for the first time in a long time, Sunny Meadows felt like a real community again. Mr. Johnson stood up and proposed that we use this transition time to review and revise the HOA rules themselves, making them more reasonable and focused on genuine community improvement, rather than petty restrictions. The proposal was met with enthusiastic approval. As the meeting wrapped up and people started to leave, many stopped to shake my hand or thank me. You started this, Harold, Frank said. You were the first one to stand up to her. I just trimmed my hedges, I said with a smile. I didn't mean to start a revolution. Sometimes that's how revolutions start, Jessica said, giving me a hug. One person doing something simple and refusing to back down when bullied. As I walked home that night, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The streetlights of Sunny Meadows seemed brighter, the air fresher. I thought about Margaret and how she would have handled this whole situation with more grace than I had, but also how she would have been proud that I'd stood up for what was right. When I got home, I sat in my living room and looked at her picture on the mantel. Over the next few weeks, I watched our neighborhood transform. Without the constant fear of violation, notices and fines, people started coming outside again. There were impromptu gatherings on lawns, kids playing basketball in driveways, and neighbors actually talking to each other instead of avoiding eye contact. The audit that Linda conducted revealed that Karen had indeed misused about $15,000 in HOA funds, mostly for legal fees related to her personal vendettas against residents. The management company worked with a lawyer to recover those funds, and Karen quietly settled rather than face potential criminal charges. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Karen had put her house up for sale. Part of me felt sad about that. Despite everything, I had hoped she might find a way to change, to learn from this experience. But I understood that sometimes people need to start fresh somewhere else. About a month after the big meeting, I was outside doing my Saturday morning yard work, trimming the same hedges that had started this whole saga. It was around 8 in the morning, and I was using my electric trimmer without any fear of police cars showing up. Jessica came over with Emma, who was carrying a small potted plant. We wanted to give you this, Mr. Thompson, Jessica said. It's a thank you for everything you did. You didn't have to do that, I said, but I was touched by the gesture. Yes, we did, Emma said seriously. Mommy says you're a hero because you stood up to the mean lady. I knelt down to Emma's level. I'm not a hero, sweetheart. I just did what anyone should do when they see someone being treated unfairly. The real heroes are all the neighbors who found the courage to speak up at that meeting. Can we help you plant it? Emma asked, holding up the pot. I would love that, I said. So we spent the morning planting the new flower together, Emma chattering away about her school and her friends, Jessica relaxing in a way I'd never seen before, and me feeling grateful for this simple, perfect moment of community and kindness. The following month, Sunny Meadows held elections for a new HOA board. The turnout was incredible, with over 80% of residents voting. Mr. Johnson was elected president, Mrs. Chen became vice president, and Frank took the role of treasurer. Jessica, despite her busy schedule, agreed to serve as secretary. At their first official meeting, the new board proposed and passed a complete revision of the HOA rules. The new rules were simple and focused on genuine community well-being. Keep your property reasonably maintained, be respectful of your neighbors, and contribute to making Sunny Meadows a welcoming place for everyone. They eliminated the absurd restrictions on garden gnome heights, basketball hoops, and minor aesthetic details. They created a community fund to help neighbors who were struggling with maintenance costs, and they established a monthly community gathering where neighbors could voice concerns and celebrate successes together. I was invited to speak at that first community gathering under the new board. I stood before my neighbors, many of whom had become true friends through this ordeal, and shared what I'd learned. Margaret, my late wife, used to say that a community is only as strong as its kindness, I said. For a while, we lost sight of that. We let fear and rules take the place of compassion and understanding. But we found our way back. We remembered that we're not just residents in an HOA. We're neighbors, friends, and a community that takes care of each other. The applause that followed made my eyes water. After the gathering, as people mingled and kids played in the community center yard, I felt Margaret's presence so strongly. This was what she would have wanted, what we had dreamed of when we first moved to Sunny Meadows. A few months later, I was surprised to receive a letter in the mail. The return address was from a town about 50 miles away. When I opened it, I found a handwritten note from Karen. "Dear Harold," it read, "I've had a lot of time to think about everything that happened. I've been seeing a therapist, and I'm starting to understand that my behavior came from my own insecurities and need for control. I'm writing to apologize for the pain I caused you and the other residents of Sunny Meadows. You tried to reach out to me with kindness, and I rejected it. I'm sorry for that too. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm working on becoming a better person. I hope Sunny Meadows is thriving without me. Sincerely, Karen." I sat with that letter for a long time, feeling a mix of emotions. Sadness for the years Karen had wasted being angry and controlling. Relief that she was seeking help and trying to change, and gratitude that our community had survived and come out stronger. I wrote back to her, a short note wishing her well on her journey, and letting her know that I did forgive her, because that's what Margaret would have wanted me to do. That's what builds true communities, not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of grace. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun set over Sunny Meadows, I reflected on the whole experience. It had started with something so simple, just an old man trimming his hedges on a Saturday morning, but it had turned into a lesson about standing up for what's right, about community, about the importance of kindness even in conflict, and about how ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they find the courage to use their voices. The next Saturday morning, I was out at my usual time, trimming those same hedges. But this time, Mr. Johnson was mowing his lawn across the street. Mrs. Chen was tending her garden gnomes, and Jessica was teaching Emma how to pull weeds. We were all outside together, not in fear, but in the simple joy of taking care of our homes and being part of a community that had learned to care for each other. And somewhere, I knew Margaret was smiling. The story of the HOA Karen who called the cops on me for doing yard work at 8 in the morning had become something more than just a tale of conflict. It had become a story about resilience, community, and the power of standing up for what's right. Even when you're just a 72-year-old retired teacher who likes to trim his hedges in peace, life in Sunny Meadows continued on, better and brighter than before. The lessons we learned from those difficult months stayed with us. We learned that rules should serve people, not control them. We learned that real community is built on kindness, not fear. And we learned that sometimes, it takes just one person refusing to back down to inspire a whole neighborhood to find their courage. As for me, I continued my Saturday morning yard work routine, always starting around 8 a.m., always with my quiet electric trimmer, and always with a grateful heart for the community we had built together. And every time I trimmed those hedges that had started it all, I remembered that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. And that's the truth of it. Sometimes the smallest acts of defiance against unreasonable authority, the quietest insistence on basic human dignity and kindness, can ripple out and change everything. You don't have to be loud or aggressive or even particularly brave. You just have to be willing to stand firm when it matters, to speak truth when others are silent, and to remember that at the end of the day, we're all just human beings trying to make our way in this world, and we do that best when we do it together, with compassion, understanding, and grace.